All right, how's it going, y'all? Today, we're going to be going over why pretty much every single video production house really needs a NAS. And I'm going to be talking about this with relation to Synology NAS just because it's a bit easier for me to explain. But any NAS at all is huge. And actually, everything we're going to be going over here today will actually carry over to whatever else you do. For larger video production houses, I'm talking about people who have like a petabyte of space. I really start recommending using TrueNAS Scale or Core instead. But for smaller productions who are using under 100 terabytes, Synology tends to be what I recommend. I do a lot of consulting. You can check the link down in the description below with setting up video production houses, NASs, and that is really kind of what I've ended up specializing in. And it is something that can really make a video production house or even just a small editing group a lot more efficient because it eliminates the need to copy and move files around or have 800 of those tiny portable SSDs and trying to remember what footage is on which SSD. And every time you want to get somebody's feedback, you have to switch drives and everything like that. Having a NAS is phenomenal. And this video is going to cover everything you need to know to set up a NAS for a video production house or even just basic video editing. We're going to start with just the overview of the basic workflow on how it actually works and how everybody communicates and how the software actually sees it. Then we're going to go into kind of what things you need to buy and what things to look at when buying a NAS for video editing, really focusing on hard drives versus SSDs versus 10 gig networking and all of those kinds of things, and where you should be spending money in upgrades that will actually matter and make the NAS a lot more usable. Finally, at the end, we're going to talk about a few custom configurations you want to make sure are enabled and some that are disabled whenever you're deploying a NAS for video editing to make it the most effective solution for the team. All right, so first we're going to get started here with really the basics of what a NAS is for video editing and how it differs from a standard external drive that you plug into your machine and edit off of. So this is what a lot of people start out doing, and I've actually seen some pretty big companies still just using a bunch of drives that they're carrying around and moving around, and that is because it's simple, it makes sense, and it's been working for a long time. Using a NAS for video editing is a very different mindset. And there are three really huge advantages to using a NAS for video editing rather than just using a standard drive that I'm going to talk about here. The first is the fact that everybody has access to everything. Now, if you want to see the most recent version of a project, you don't have to go tracking somebody down and find it on their drive. It also means that if you want to reference somebody else's clip, you can just do that without having to constantly make sure your stuff's in sync. If they re-export it, it will automatically show up as a new clip in there. Very simple. And a huge component of that is the fact that you can actually be opening up projects on different computers really quickly. So for example, if you are a single editor even, and you have two machines, once you finish the clip on one desktop, you can just pull out your laptop and export it on there while you go back to editing a different clip on your desktop again. It also means that whenever somebody's done with a project and you want to review it and make edits to it, you just have to say, okay, I'm done. They open it, they see everything you've been editing and can live edit it. If you also use something like Premiere, you can also even have team modes where you check out sections of a video and say, hey, I'm working on this section of the video. And that way multiple people can all be working on the exact same project at the exact same time using this checkout process. It depends on the exact editing software you use. Both Davinci and Adobe Premiere have the ability to check in and check out footage where multiple people can have the same project open at the same time, whereas Final Cut Pro without third-party plugins does not allow you to do that. It is phenomenal. Everybody just has access to all the resources very easily. Two is everything is in one place. And these are actually two distinct things because it makes backing things up so much easier. So now you don't have to worry if everything made it onto the proper drive and make sure that everything's being backed up constantly. So if something like this fails, you are not in trouble and you've not lost 3 weeks of work. Instead, the NAS can be easily backed up. You can include RAID for redundancy, and you can also say, hey, I want to have two NASs, one of them that's the very powerful one that's maybe SSD, and then a second one that every 15 minutes gets an updated copy of anything that's changed in the last 15 minutes. You can do that and save a ton of money and make sure that if the entire main NAS crashes, who knows what happens, your video production house has not lost any work and you can actually get back up and running almost instantly, albeit with slightly less performance, but you're working rather than trying to call up your producers and say, hey, can you resend us that drive? We lost it all. And finally, 3, which I'm not going to talk about as much here as I have a video coming out about it soon, is it unlocks tons of potential with remote editors. There are 3 different ways that I recommend deploying remote editors, and I've got a video coming out. I think it's gonna be like 2 weeks after this one, somewhere around there, this comes out. I go over 3 ways to work with remote editors. 1 is to just simply have them download the footage. 2 is to send them proxy footage and things like that. And so that way they don't have to have the full thing and you can relink it yourself. And then 3 is actually them remote desktoping using something like Parsec to actually have a computer at your house or at your office network they just remote into. So the footage never has to actually leave your office network. So you can have somebody out in rural Idaho working on a 5 terabyte project without having to download any of it. They just simply stream the computer that it's editing on. If you've got good internet speed, you no longer are shipping drives around the country, which is huge. All right, so now those are the 3 big use cases for using a NAS as your storage for video editing. I now want to go over a really basic overview of some really simple questions that people often hear when you're looking at setting up a video editing NAS for a company. First off, how do you connect to the NAS? So if you're used to using external drives, you're used to just simply plugging them in via USB or Thunderbolt. It's simple. You plug it into your computer formats the drive, and that drive is however it's set up. When you're using a NAS for video editing, instead of it actually plugging in physically, you normally plug it in via Ethernet. You access a NAS via networking. NAS stands for networking attached storage. So think of your NAS as a hard drive hooked up to your local network. There are multiple speeds of networking, and normally that will be your bottleneck, unless you go 10 gig. So there is 1 gig, which is what almost everything consumer is. Note, these are different speeds than what your internet speed is. So even if you have a 50 megabit internet plan, you can still have a 1 gig or a 10 gig network at your house because you've got 2 different speeds. There's your internet speed for everything going out to the internet like Google, and then there's your local speed for anything you're accessing on your local area network, such as the NAS. So those are a common misconception there, is that if you want to go 10 gig, you have to buy a 10 gig router, where you do not need to buy a 10 gig router just to do 10 gig speeds. So you access it just like this. So right here, you can see on the left-hand side, I'm on macOS and I've mounted these drives, and this is my working folder. So right here, I can actually just open up one of these Final Cut Pro projects that's stored on the server. And as long as nobody else has it open, Final Cut will let me go ahead and edit it just the same. All my footage is stored on there. I can go in and edit it and do everything I need to just like that. All the footage is there, and it's very easy. I can close this project and then just open it up on my desktop right there and keep going. It's very easy to set up, and now pretty much all NLEs just automatically recognize SMB shares very easily. So on macOS, you just go into Finder over here on the left-hand side, and you should see the server over there. And on Windows, you just map the network drive, and you are off to the races. Whenever you're streaming footage, the footage never gets downloaded to your computer. It is only downloading the specific frame that is specifically being used and displayed on the screen at the exact same time. It's just like editing off a hard drive, where you edit off an external hard drive. You're never saving that data to your local drive. Instead, it just streams whatever it's currently using from that drive. It works the exact same way. And so that is a really key component, is depending on how much footage you have and how large your footage is, you may need to change your networking. But I'm going to touch on all that in a little bit here. All right, and so now, just like that, it is acting like a normal external drive, except everybody else is able to be working on these files as well. And so it's pretty simple. As long as you have everybody editing on the local network, everybody will be able to just grab the footage that pertains to them. And so you can even use multiple pieces of footage in multiple projects without having to copy it to multiple places by just all having it at the same target. It's very, very, very powerful. You can just close and open projects exactly how you would on an external drive. And as long as nobody else is using them, or you're using software that allows multiple people to be in the same project, you're good. It's just going to work how you expect it to. One question I often get asked is it doing anything other than storage? People also often hear I'm editing on a NAS and think that the NAS itself is somehow has something to do with the CPU and GPU when you're exporting and rendering videos. No, the NAS is only acting as a hard drive. Just like your hard drive does not render any footage. Your CPU and GPU within the computer are what are doing all the heavy lifting and all the actual exporting. The NAS itself is only handing off footage, the actual files, to the computer itself. All right, so that is the very basic overview of this workflow. It just simply shows up as a regular drive, and you're able to just start video editing off of it with an incredible experience. It is incredibly valuable to be able to be working on the same project and never have to deal with external drives, and there's so much more you can build off of. But we're now going to transition over to talking about what hardware to look at purchasing when you're setting something like this up. And there's a few different categories I'm just going to go through and kind of talk about. The first, and by far the most important for the video editing experience, is going to be the networking. So there are really 4 different types of networking that we're going to talk about here. There are really just 4 different standards at 4 different speeds. You can think of them as the difference between USB 2, USB 3, and all of those kinds of things. They're going to limit down how fast the NAS can send files to your computer. For all intents and purposes, there's going to be 1 gig, 2.5 gig, 10 gig, and 25 gig. 1 gig is stock on pretty much every computer. If you buy just a normal off-the-shelf motherboard, it's probably going to have a 1 gig port on it, though 2.5 gig is starting. Whenever you're thinking about how much speed all of these networks can do, it's more useful to think about them in megabytes per second. When I say 1 gig, it means 1 gigabit, not 1 gigabyte. There's a difference between bytes and bits. So a 1 gig connection will give you up to 120 megabytes per second. So that is the speed of a basic SD card. I think UHS 1 cards. It's actually usable for basic 4K footage without a high bit rate. If it's H.264, H.265, you probably can edit it off of a 1 gig connection. And that's what is standard on pretty much all NASs as the very base level. A lot of the nicer ones do come with 2.5 gig and 10 gig built in, but that is the base level that all NASs built within the past 5 years should have at least a 1 gig connection. And that is where you can buy a $30 switch very cheap. So the easiest way to tell what you need in terms of a NAS for footage throughput is to simply record a 5-minute clip. Go ahead and record a 5-minute clip of your video, then take that size of the video and divide it by how many seconds were in that clip. So if you did 5 minutes exactly, that would be 300 seconds. So if it was a 10 gig clip and it was a 5-minute clip, that would be 33 megabytes per second. That is how you can tell how many megabytes per second your camera is shooting very easily. When you're then looking at a NAS, because of variable bitrate in footage, I often tell people, give yourself a 50% overhead. So just take the size of the clip, divided by how many seconds that clip was, and then multiply it by 1.5. So for this 10 gig clip, that was 300 seconds long, I'm then going to multiply it by 1.5, and I'm going to say I need probably at least 50 megabytes per second to effectively edit that footage. A 1 gig connection, as I said earlier, can do 120 megabytes per second. So in this case, I could pretty safely either have 2 editors playing back this footage off a 1 gig connection, or have 2 cameras of multicam off of this theoretical footage. I generally recommend at least a 2.5 gig setup for doing any kind of 4K multicam stuff at all. Generally, it's very valuable to have that networking upgrade. So 1 gig can do 120 megabytes per second. 2.5 gig can do about 275 megabytes per second. Everything I'm telling you here has a little bit of overhead built in for the actual protocol. 10 gig can do about 1.1 gigabytes per second to 1 gigabyte per second. And then 25 gig, which is pretty rare to actually install, can do about 2.2 gigabytes per second fairly reliably. And so that is what to look at for networking. And when it comes to networking, there are 2 components. There is what is hooked up to the actual NAS. So many NASs have an expansion slot. So you can start with 1 gig ports on it, and then this one has an optional 10 gig add-in card. And so you can put in that 10 gig add-in card to get 10 gig speed out of it. Desktop computers, you can just simply buy a PCIe expansion card for. And then laptops, you can buy adapters like this that are either 1 gig, 2.5 gig, or 10 gig, and they simply plug in. I will say, For laptops, I really like editing off of 2.5 gig connections because they're much lower power draw and much smaller. 10 gig networking adapters tend to be very large, very high power draw, and are pretty difficult to work with. For laptops, I really enjoy using 2.5 gig because you can also use USB-C rather than just Thunderbolt 3. So that is the basics of networking. For the networking side of things, I'm going to have a section of links down in the description below that covers a bunch of really good switches for these kinds of things and the actual networking adapters. So go ahead and check those out down in the description below. There's a bunch of them, and that way I can keep them updated as time goes on because there's often better ones in and out of stock. But whenever you're looking at your switch, you need to make sure that it supports the protocol you're looking for, so 2.5 or 10 gig, and it needs to have enough ports that you're looking for. The other important thing to do is think about how many people are going to be connecting at once. And this is going to bleed over into our next discussion about hard drives, SSDs, and how many to buy. So if you're going to have 10 editors who are actually all going to be editing at the exact same time, you need to make sure that you can actually support that kind of throughput. In general, it's going to be pretty rare to have actually all 10 editors playing back footage at the exact same time. I normally would be pretty safe saying, okay, if you've got 10 editors, you probably just need to have 5 times the throughput of one single clip just to be sure. Give yourself some overhead on that because it's pretty rare that all people are going to be playing back footage at the exact same time and not having anything in RAM, because these are all kind of worst case scenarios. But you need to make sure to think about that the switch supports enough ports that you're looking for, because every single person will need to have their own connection to the NAS via the switch. If you have 6 editors that you'd like to have video editing, you're going to want to buy at least an 8-port switch. One of the ports will be used to actually plug in the NAS into the switch, and then that 8th port will be used to actually plug in the switch into your router. So that is the basics of what to start with. Just make sure you've got 2 extra ports for however many editors you're going to start with, and then it's never a bad idea to buy a little bit larger of a switch just in case you add more computers. And you're also going to need to make sure that your NAS can actually handle playing back enough footage for that. Another thing to think about is multicam. If you're doing multicam and you've got 4 clips, it's got to send you all 4 of those clips. So you need to multiply your bitrate by 4x. And so as you can see, there's a ton of complex stuff that goes into this. But to simplify it down, in general, if you have up to 8 video editors, a 10 gig NAS should pretty easily be able to handle that, unless you're doing tons of multicam stuff where everybody's got like 6 cameras and you have really high bitrate footage. I would expect pretty easily a 10 gig NAS to be able to have 8 editors pretty easily. From there, you can do link aggregation and increase your throughput like that. But for the most part, you should be fine for most video production houses with a single 10 gig connection. Often what I recommend setting up for people is buy a NAS with a 10 gig card in it. Then go ahead and hook up that NAS to the switch via 10 gig. And so that way there's 10 gigs of throughput between the switch and the NAS. Then you can hook up all the laptops via 2.5 gig Ethernet. That way it's just an easy adapter that's cheap and easy to use. And you can hook up any of the workstations via 10 gig. OWC also makes a Thunderbolt dock that I will go ahead and put down a link in the description below that also has a 10 gig network on it, which is actually what Katie uses upstairs for her video editing. Just plugs her laptop into it, immediately gets 10 gig speeds, and is off to the races. And so right there, that was the most complex part about what to purchase when video editing, and it's about the networking. Now let's go into hard drives versus SSDs. And towards the end of this, I'm going to go over the exact models to buy and some buyouts. And go ahead and check down the link in the description. I'm going to have basically full packages for exactly what you should get for X, Y, and Z kind of video editing house that are easy places to start. The next question that is really important is hard drives versus SSDs. One thing to understand about a NAS is a NAS you almost always set up in what's called a RAID. RAID combines the throughput of multiple drives into the speed of a single drive for sequential reads. So if you have 8 drives in a RAID 6 array, you're going to have 6 drives of throughput because 2 of those drives are going to be used for redundancy. And so if each of those drives can do 200 megabytes per second, now all 8 of those drives can do 1.2 gigabytes per second. And so that is where you can actually use hard drives to actually be able to play back the footage. And hard drives, almost always, if you have enough of them, will be able to play back footage for pretty much any camera you can imagine. Where SSDs really shine is actually their ability when you're scrubbing through a timeline. So when you're scrubbing through a timeline and seeing all those random frames and fast forwarding or rewinding really quickly, you are actually randomly reading different pieces of data that is not very predictable. That means that if you have a hard drive volume, you now are having to skip around more and you're not getting as many frames out. Normally I say when you're scrubbing through a timeline, when you have good SSDs, you can get 3 times as many frames in the scrub than if you were using hard drives. Now that being said, I've set up a ton of video production houses who can hardly tell the difference between hard drives and SSDs because they're still getting so many frames that they can hardly tell that it's faster or slower. But hard drives have the advantage of having way more capacity. So if you want to have just one place to store all of your data and you want to get like 6 hard drives, then you're going to have a very good editing experience unless you start getting too many editors. SSDs do not have the same slowdown when it comes to random reads. So that scrubbing does not slow them down nearly as much because they can read data across all the sections of the drive at the exact same time. So if you're looking to have a ton of editors all hitting the NAS at the exact same time, having an all SSD array is huge. So you can actually combine and get the best of both worlds. So what I'll often set up for people who are like a larger studio is you can actually buy a 12-bay NAS, stick 5 SSDs in there and use that as the editing volume. So that's the one that's actively in use. And so whenever you've got a new project, it goes in there until it's done. Then you fill the other 7 bays with hard drives. And so that way, as soon as the project's over and it's done and it's been shipped off to the client, but you don't want to delete it yet, you copy it to the hard drives, which have way more capacity for way less money, but you're not editing off of them constantly, and so it's not as big of a deal. And so you can actually get the best of both worlds on that. When it comes to the number of drives, the important thing to do is if you're buying hard drives, you want to make sure you have at least 4 hard drives to be able to do about 3 streams of 4K footage is about what I would recommend it. Also, when you're using hard drives, you do not want them to go above 80% utilization in terms of space. So you don't want to fill it up above 80% capacity because after you get up to those levels, you really start to feel slow down where the hard drive has to be moving around constantly to find the data you're looking for, and they get a lot slower. SSDs do not suffer from that as much. So in general, for about 3 streams of 4K footage, I would recommend having at least 4 hard drives that are 7200 RPM. Most drives over 8 terabytes will be 7200 RPM or higher in a RAID 5 configuration. You will often see people recommending RAID 10 for editing. I would not recommend RAID 10 unless you have a really specific use case and you're going to have about 12 hard drives all in the same array. But in general, if you're looking at RAID 10, you probably can get a better experience with using SSDs in RAID 5 than you can with a bunch of hard drives in RAID 10. And so that leads us into the question for number of bays. And it really mostly comes down to what you're looking to do. If you're using SSDs, you're probably going to want to use at least RAID 5. RAID 5 basically takes down 1 drive for fault tolerance. So if you have 5 drives in RAID 5, you have 4 drives of capacity. So if you've got 4 terabyte drives in RAID 5, you're going to have 16 terabytes of usable space. So that's really where you're going to want to budget how much active data you think you're going to do. It's really nice to have SSDs for active data and hard drives for exported and finished files. All right, so now I'm going to go through and show some units that I recommend from Synology for video editors. Right here is about where I recommend most people start. If you're serious about video editing, the DS1522 Plus is a solid unit to start with. It has optional 10 gig upgrade, 8 gigs of RAM, and 5 bays. So this means if you put 5 20 terabyte hard drives in there, you should be able to get about 600 to 800 megabytes per second reliably if you go the 10 gig upgrade. So if you fill this entire thing with 20 terabyte hard drives, so 5 20 terabyte hard drives, you'll have 80 terabytes of usable space, and you'll be able to get about 600 megabytes per second pretty reliably, even if it's about 50-60% full. It also has 8 gigs of RAM, which is useful. So that is a great place to start. Then if you're looking to kind of upgrade and have more space, I would actually skip over the DS1621 Plus because for an extra $100, you can buy the 1821 Plus, which has 2 additional bays. These 2 units have essentially identical specs overall, but for that extra $100, this investment, buying the 1821 Plus, will likely serve you for another extra couple of years because you can say, oh, hey, I need to get more space, plug in 2 more hard drives and expand out your RAID. It allows you to do that. And so I really like recommending the 1821 Plus for that reason. This unit right here is a very solid unit that will be able to handle probably 10 editors. And you can also do things like have 4 drives for SSDs for that active volume, and then 4 drives of hard drives where you can be storing your archival footage. Then the next step up, I would then jump up to the 3622 XS Plus. Though note, these 3 models right here, all are going to quote unquote require Synology drives, which means your cost per drive will go up by as much as 2 times. If you are doing this on a budget, which a lot of video production houses are, you can actually be okay not buying the drives, though you will always have a orange light on it saying, hey, warning, the volume has unverified drives. It is unfortunate, and Synology is essentially trying to get larger businesses to buy their drives. If you have the money for the Synology drives, they actually work very well. I've deployed them in video editing systems and they work very well. They are just very expensive. So all 3 of these units will have that warning. If you are comfortable ignoring that, it's not a bad thing to ignore. The 1823 XS Plus is significantly more expensive than the 1821 Plus, and it does not have as much value as I would say. It's probably not worth it for most people. If you're looking at that, I would go straight to the DS3622 XS Plus. As time goes on and these units get updated, I will go ahead and put links down in the description below for the new models that I recommend. But these are the recommendations for my desktop units. If you're unsure of how many bays you should purchase, it's never a bad idea to purchase a larger NAS and fill only halfway to start. That way, as you need more space, you can just add in more drives and expand it out and get that without having to buy a new unit and reset it up. And so all of these units have the ability to upgrade to 10 gig networking. And so I would really recommend doing that to start because it will make your editing experience significantly better, especially when you're copying over large files. The last 2 performance upgrades we're going to talk about today are going to be RAM and SSD caching. If you are buying a unit and going to be editing off of the hard drive volume, you want to look at getting an NVMe SSD cache. Basically, just buy a single NVMe drive, about 500 gigs to a terabyte, and use that as a read-only SSD cache. What'll happen is anytime you're randomly reading data often, it'll be stored on that NVMe drive as well as on the hard drive volume, really speeding up the next time you need to read it. And so that way your hard drives are not spending as much time randomly reading data because the NVMe drive is reading a lot of the random data. So that can be very valuable for a hard drive only editing setup, though if your main editing volume is SSD, it is only going to give you worse performance. Finally, RAM. 4 gigs of RAM is sufficient for pretty much all editing, though if you do have a lot of people running, a upgrade to 8 gigs can be valuable, especially if you're running other applications. Past that, unless you're doing stuff in addition to video editing and running some programs that require extra RAM, it's probably not worth upgrading past 8 gigs of RAM. All right, so now I want to spend some time going over some custom settings I recommend for video editors on Synology NAS. So just come on over into DSM, and the biggest ones are under the SMB settings under File Services. Go into Advanced Settings, and you want to make sure that yours reflect this. So you want to make sure to disable encryption and signing because both of those will slow down your performance. And check these right here. This is pretty much your recommended settings. For others, you're going to want to scroll down and enable asynchronous read for a video editing server right here. And you're not going to want to enable SMBv3 multi-channel because SMBv3 multi-channel will actually slow down random reads slightly. And so it can make a video editing experience slightly worse. So I do not recommend multi-channel for video production houses. Those are the big 2 settings. Finally, any modern units likely do not need jumbo frames. If you've seen previous my videos on jumbo frames, you've seen how great they are. The CPUs in modern Synologies have stepped up a lot where they're not really as important. And so I don't find that jumbo frames are that important anymore, though you can always do the testing on your own systems. All right, so now that is the basics of using a NAS for video editing. In summation, it's really valuable to have a single place to store all of your files, especially as you have more and more video editors. Overall, getting a NAS set up for video editing takes a little bit of work and understanding to get set up, but after that, it adds a ton of value. If you'd like to hire me to set this up for you or your company, there's a hire me link down in the description below. If you have any other questions, go put those in the comments below. All right, have a good one. Bye.